obviously, it's been 13 days now since the election, and comrades will have, you know, even the least John Curtis-like of you will have had a look at the results, and I'm sure registered the shock at the results because it is absolutely shocking. Um, of course, the first point we need to make is that the Tories, the traditional party of the ruling class for hundreds of years, was effectively at local government level destroyed by Reform UK. Simply extraordinary results. Two-thirds of their councillors were lost. The average number of seats lost in each council was 30 seats, 30 in one go. And of course, in Kent, they lost 57 seats to Reform in one evening. Simply extraordinary. And beyond that, of course, they also lost three councils to the Liberal Democrats, Cambridgeshire, Oxfordshire, and Shropshire. Alternatively, Reform won 677 councillors, which is beyond their wildest hopes. So much, in fact, that as Jamie's already referred to, some of them were so surprised at winning they've immediately resigned, or they've suddenly found out that they work for local government and actually can't. They're not entitled to stand, or that they're serving in the armed forces and are unable to stand, and all this sort of nonsense. And so they're resigning, and others just resigning because they don't want to be councillors. Um, so that gives you the scale of their victory. They didn't expect to win that many, but they did. And they've taken control of county councils from the Tories right across the North Midlands, from Staffordshire right the way over to Lincolnshire. They took control of the mayoralties in Hull and East Yorkshire, and in Greater Lincolnshire. And of course, they took control, as I've already referred, to the county council in Kent, which is an extraordinary result. The Liberal Democrats and the Greens, it's worth pointing out, each if broadly doubled the number of seats, which is worth pointing out. They're sort of traditional party, historically, if you like, the sober representatives of capitalism, that have had hundreds of years practice of doing this. The men in suits in oak-panelled rooms that would generally run society for them. But since Brexit, the Tory party have gone rogue and are still sort of engaged in the process of gradual car crash self-destruction, down to, I think, 17% of the popular vote now. The Reform Party is useful to the bosses. It's useful to the bosses as a way of shattering working class unity. It's useful for they can promote xenophobia and nationalism and racism and sexism and strict gender roles and anti-trans hatred. Really, any kind of not whipped up nonsense culture war will do. Anything to stop workers from actually identifying capitalism as the problem, rather than and capitalism as the enemy. Blame anybody else except capitalism. But Reform, of course, although they're useful to the capitalist class, they are also a loose cannon. They're a risky bet for business, and they're liable to be swayed by kind of unpredictable populism and not really trusted to rule. They're not trusted to win, even though they're useful as a divisive force inside working class communities to strengthen capital. But it's when we look at the Labour results that we see the catastrophe, and there's really no other word for it. Remember, the 2021 results, which is the last time these councils were already extremely bad, including the loss of the Hartlepool by-election, which is almost led, and wouldn't that have been wonderful? It almost led to Keir Starmer's resignation as Labour leader. But now these results are much worse even than that. In the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, Reform overturned a 15,000 Labour majority to win by 6 votes. And the local council results are worse even than Left Horizons predicted. We wrote an article just before the election predicting disaster, but we didn't predict a disaster as big as this. Again, 2/3 of the seats were lost. And so the Tories lost 2/3 of seats from a high point. Labour have lost 2/3 of their seats from a historic low point. There were huge losses in Doncaster, in Lancashire, in Northumberland, but it was in Durham, which have been completely eye-popping, jaw-dropping results, which have been the biggest shock. Labour had lost control already back in 2021, for the first time in 100 years, by the way. But now they're reduced to just 4 seats out of a total of 98, while Reform took 65 seats. It's incredible result. Labour took the mayoralties in previous Labour heartlands in Doncaster and North Tyneside, but just scraped through on wins of about 30-odd% of the vote. In the west of England, they were saved by our stupid electoral system, winning on just 25% of the votes. pipping Reform into second place and the Greens in third. So we have to look at these results and just accept that in spite of sitting on a majority of 170 in Parliament, Starmer is without doubt the worst leader of the Labour Party has ever had. He's dull, robotic, charisma-free zone, a shameless liar without principles of any kind, let alone socialist ones, a ruthless authoritarian inside the party, crushing all dissent. And of course, he's complicit with the war crimes of the Israeli state against the people of Gaza and Palestine more widely. He's committed to solving the crisis of capitalism at the expense of students, about poor, larger families, the elderly, international aid, and now, of course, the disabled. He's desperate to be seen as a safe pair of hands for capitalism. And to be in many sections of capitalism, they prefer to see him in power than actually reform all the Tories, because he's so obviously a respectable prime minister from the point of view of international capitalism. And he's hidebound himself with Reeves's self-imposed fiscal rules to make sure that he does nothing to interfere the rule of capital. And they got the cheek to wonder why they're losing votes. In many areas, Labour isn't just previous Labour voters are not just disappointed or angry. They hate the Labour Party. There's a visceral hatred of the party in some communities, and that's not putting it over strong. A friend of mine in Warwickshire, they had to call off canvassing because the hatred of the Labour Party was so bad that canvassing was unsafe. And many Reform voters, remember, they're not all far right hidebound racists. That's a wrong thing to say, and it's wrong to have that way of condemning Reform voters. These are people that have previously voted for Corbyn who now vote for Reform. And what they're doing, they're simply protesting about such anti-working class policies that Starmer's pursuing. And Starmer doesn't even have the sort of centrist, socially progressive principles of New Labour, as the recent shocking betrayal of the rights of trans people has demonstrated, rolling back the liberal progressive gains made under the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And now, of course, they're trying to mimic Reform on asylum and immigration issues, which simply legitimizes anti-migrant feeling and boosts Reform even more. What's the point of voting Labour as Reform light if you can vote for the real thing in Reform? They can't outdo Reform. And this recent shocking speech from Starmer, effectively quoting from Enoch Powell, is just a new low in this monstrous leadership. But the issue we have to deal with is, where does that leave the left? And I think the first task, of course, is a very practical one. We have to build local campaigns of resistance to the Reform-led councils to resist their petty racism and bigotry. Local government workers need to fight for their own jobs and conditions against probable threatened redundancies. There's a need to protect schools, particularly trans kids, but also kids in general, from a kind of a new anti-woke agenda, pushing patriotism that they're talking about, all this kind of bigotry and stuff that's going to be reintroduced into the education system. So teachers and local government workers in general need to fight that. But the problem with any local united campaign against Reform is that the Labour Party are conceding on all these points. They're leaning into these ideas. And so any local campaigns will need to fight Reform locally and Labour nationally, which is a very awkward place to be. I think the rise of Reform has echoes of what happened in France in recent years. The right-wing Socialist Party government, the pro-capitalist, anti-working class government of the Socialist Party under François Hollande, led to the utter electoral decimation of the French Socialist Party, reducing it to 6% of the popular vote. And of course, the far-right neo-fascist Front National took seats throughout most of the traditional heartlands of the French Socialist Party and the Communist Party, including northern French mining areas, very similar to Durham and other ex-coalfields of Yorkshire and Lancashire. The Front National also eclipsed traditional establishment parties of the Republican right. So effectively, the Front National took loads and loads of votes off of the French Tory party, the Gaullists, Republicans. And of course, in France, Macron left the Socialist Party to start a new centrist party and rapidly moved from centrism, alleged centrism, to far-right attacks on workers, even worse than Hollande did. And then, of course, La France Insoumise, the party under the charismatic left leader of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, broke away. and has formed a left group with significant electoral support, overtaking the Socialist Party. Now, we have no crystal ball, and we can't say that everything that happened in France will happen here. Perspectives are one thing, but crystal balls are another. But it is certainly possible that Starmer could lead Labour into an unprecedented defeat and a collapse of its vote in the next general election, just as Hollande did in France, with similar consequences. So we have to wonder, could Starmer actually be dumped before the election? I still think it's unlikely. His faction has an iron grip on the Parliamentary Labour Party currently and on local councillors, all of which are hand-picked when all democratic processes have been abandoned, really. And they've got a complete grip on the apparatus of the party. But it is conceivable, nonetheless, that even right-wing Labour MPs and councillors, if they're looking down the barrel of a gun, if they're facing electoral oblivion, could attempt a reset around some slightly more left-sounding, more popular, or at least some more intelligent or effective leader than Starmer. And if the election results and opinion polls don't improve in the next 2 or 3 years, all bets are off, really. The crucial role in all this will be that of the trade unions, who need to fight not against Starmer and Reeves outside the party, in workplaces, communities, of course, on all sorts of campaigns, and also inside the party, and crucially inside the party, making use of the financial levers and the voting bloc that trade unions enjoy inside the party. It's essential that members of the affiliated trade unions put massive pressure on their leaders to do exactly that, to use the power that they have inside the Labour Party and the votes they have. Even unions led by right-wing leaders may be forced into taking action against the Labour government to defend their wages, jobs and conditions, and to fight further cuts to public spending that Labour is bound to try and implement as their promised growth doesn't materialise in future. The union leaders are currently pinning all their hopes on the Employment Rights Bill, and they don't want to rock the boat until that bill's gone through. But even that is likely to be undermined and amended in any case, in the interests of the bosses. But we'll wait and see what happens there. Internally, the Labour Party is being hollowed out. It's a husk. The members are less active, or they've left altogether. The left has been ruthlessly uprooted, with parties suspended and individuals expelled or bullied and forced to leave. Other socialists, other good socialists, have walked away themselves in legitimate disgust at what the government is doing. I just saw recently the deputy leader of Hartlepool Council was resigned just now over the trans rights issue. And a councillor in Plymouth has resigned over the same matter. The meetings of the Labour Party internally are dwindling and less frequent. They're often inquorate. Campaigning is mostly done by councillors, some of whom, by the way, are actually kind of strong-armed into doing it. They don't really want to. But the canvassing is done by councillors and their friends and family, or younger wannabe careerist hangers-on. I think it's a reasonable prediction that local Labour parties will not see an influx of new members in the immediate period unless they see some chance of defeating Starmer, the Starmer-Reeves clique. So it might be after Starmer loses catastrophically, or if it's perfectly obvious that he's going to lose catastrophically, there may be some chance, if they see a move against him, that might encourage people to move in. But otherwise, they won't. I think socialists in all but a few areas will instead focus on wider grassroots struggles in trade unions or community-based campaigns, on the NHS, Palestine, benefit cuts, disability rights, and so on and so forth. Now, to be sure, there's always a need for balance. The Labour Party has been pronounced dead too often in the past 100 years. Even in my short lifetime, the Labour Party has been written off and declared dead by several people over the years. And yet here it is. It still exists and it's still around. And of course, a party that gets 25 to 30% of the vote, or even 20% of the vote, truthfully, is not yet dead by any means. There's still a residual loyalty of voters to the party, many of whom are holding their breath, I think, giving Labour the benefit of the doubt, and giving Labour the benefit of the doubt, giving it time, if you like, to deliver on the improvements to workers' lives that were promised in the manifesto, meagre as they were. Or I think a lot of workers would still vote Labour from a very real fear of reform. In areas where it's Labour or reform, a lot of workers will quite rightly vote Labour to keep out the vicious right-wing racist force and that which they see as needing to be stopped. And of course, Labour is still the party founded by the trade union movement, and millions of workers are affiliated to it through links between, although it's true to say that the links between Labour and the trade unions are now at local CLP level have mostly disappeared. And it's currently just at regional and national level that these things exist. I think it's important to be flexible and not dogmatic, to look at the real situation honestly and clear-eyed, and also need to focus on any given situation, not on any given situation at any given fleeting moment, but to look at interweaving processes as they developed in a dialectical way, as we often say. Now, I thought Left Horizons as a group, a group of lefties, socialists, always orientate ourselves in general terms to the mass organisations of the working class. And of course, that is in Britain, that's the Labour Party and the trade unions. We do this not because we have any illusions in the Labour leaders or even in the Labour Party, but also because many workers still do. We need to be where the workers are, and we need to get an audience for our ideas. We need to struggle along with workers to reclaim their own organisations, and to find an audience for our ideas amongst them. So we go where the workers are. And of course, there is a general tendency, despite everything, for workers to move into older traditional parties to fight for their interests when they see an opportunity, the possibility of doing so. They did this in the early 1980s under the Bennite movement after the Callaghan government's winter of discontent, and they did it again under the Corbyn surge in 2015. But having said that, it is certainly true that the Labour Party under Starmer has become not only, frankly, despicable in terms of its policies, but also more authoritarian in its structures and its comprehensive, sweeping disregard for any democratic norms. They have long abandoned any pretense of justice, fairness, or democracy in the internal regime. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to play any meaningful part in its structures. And this has led all over the country to individuals or small groups, including many councillors, to split away from the party and then to run for election as independents. In the last general election, of course, Corbyn won his seat easily as an independent, and Faisal Shaheen in Chingford, who was deselected just before the election started, stood as independent and got about the same vote as the official Labour candidate did. Other groups of councillors in Liverpool and sometimes the bulk of a Labour group, as in Broxtowe, just on the outskirts of Nottingham, split off and formed more durable, more permanent group of independent councillors, often around candidates who have been unfairly deselected. In the general election, again, 4 candidates rooted in the Muslim community defeated senior Labour MPs, and many more got extremely close, barely hundreds of votes away from obtaining a few more scalps, obtaining unprecedented vote shares of 20%, 30%, or even 40%, I think, in one constituency in London. And this is a very new thing. It's a new factor that we have to take into consideration. These developments, of course, are completely different to the pointless standing of paper candidates of small sectarian groups that have embarrassed themselves over the last few decades by standing and getting no votes with no local base and no respect in the movement widely. But in these new cases, many good socialists and trade unionists will see such local figures, previous councillors and previous MPs and so on, as the legitimate Labour councillors, legitimate Labour candidates. And I think it's possible that these will attract quite wide layers of activists, especially in more urban areas where there is less danger of splitting the vote. And many of these people, many of these good socialists who get involved in these campaigns could be drawn to the ideas of Marxism, of genuine socialism, if they're approached carefully and approached correctly. Now, of course, and I'll be coming to an end shortly, but if you look at social media, on the left, you're constantly bombarded by calls for a new left party. I think in the last couple of years, there's been 4 or 5 on the go. And I have to say, it's still unlikely, in my judgment, that there's going to be a new left party formed, a coherent, disciplined party. But as I speak, I have to say that there seems to be a broad umbrella group forming, involving Corbyn himself, which is kind of bringing independent left candidates all over the country under a general sort of federal umbrella structure. And so, you know, in some areas that includes the Greens, I think, and in some areas it doesn't. And then we can also expect the Greens, by the way, to pick up votes from disillusioned Labour voters. So there is this umbrella group, and I think they will do well in particular areas, and they will form a challenge to Labour, particularly in areas which are more urban. As I said, when without such the danger of splitting the vote, where it's not exactly a reform Labour marginal. Now, could there be a major left split? Could there be a serious schism involving some large trade unions? In other words, could there be a British version of Mélenchon's La France Insoumise? Um, that's not ruled out. I mean, frankly, politics has gone so bonkers over the last few years that almost nothing is ruled out. But it's neither is it a foregone conclusion. The electoral system in Britain is much worse than that in France for new parties. Um, but if it happened and attracted widespread support from trade unions and from workers, then it could be a game changer for socialists. But I have to say, currently, such a major split and a major alternative to Labour, which could challenge Labour throughout the country rather than individual groups, individual locations, is currently not in sight. So we're stuck with what we've got. Comrades, we live in stormy times, times of constant crisis of capitalism and attacks on the working class by the bosses. Their system offers nothing to workers, but unfortunately, that doesn't mean that it will in itself just abolish itself. The fact that it offers nothing doesn't mean to say that it will actually just end spontaneously. It needs to be actively ended by working class action. I think in this coming stormy period, I think all parties and workers' organisations will be thoroughly tested in this hothouse of crisis. And I think the ideas of Marxism will play an essential role of that. And within that, I think the ideas of left horizons will also play their role. And I encourage anybody who is not involved with left horizons in campaigning work to do so. And I commend my speech to the House. Thank you very much.